56 brutal stabs pierced his body, staining the royal floor red. It was a steep price for an outsider who dared to dream of power. David Rizzio died in absolute terror, his hands still clutching the dress of the pregnant Queen Mary, begging for his life. His scream during that dinner didn't just break the silence. It started the bloodiest tragedy of the dynasty. He came here carrying a lute, but he died holding the royal seal. Rizzio broke the biggest rule, a foreigner with no title trying to control Scottish politics. He openly flaunted his power and overshadowed the local nobles, driving them to a point where they decided he had to die. So who was David Rizzio, and how did a simple musician become a man they were forced to murder? He was born around 1533 in Pancalieri, a small commune near Turin in the Piedmont region of Italy. He was not, as his enemies later sneered, born in the gutter. The Rizzio family, as the name was originally spelled, were technically of noble stock, claiming the title of the Counts de San Paolo. But nobility in 16th century Italy was a fractured, tiered system. The Riccios were of the poveri vergognosi, the shamefaced poor. They had the bloodlines, but not the gold. They had the crest, but not the castle. His father was a musician. In the hierarchy of the time, this was a precarious existence, yet a strangely mobile one. A master musician was a servant, yes, but a servant who walked in the halls of princes. David inherited this duality. He inherited the ear, the dexterity of the fingers, and the resonant singing voice. But he also inherited the burning hunger of a man who knows he is better than his bank account. Growing up in the shadow of the Italian wars, where France and the Holy Roman Empire tore the peninsula apart, Rizzio learned that survival required adaptability. He learned that charm was a weapon and that information was a currency more stable than the florin. In his 20s, Rizzio entered the service of the Archbishop of Turin. The ecclesiastical courts of Italy were hotbeds of intrigue, diplomacy, and high culture. Here, Rizzio would have learned the subtle arts of the courtier, how to listen while appearing to tune an instrument, how to flatter without seeming sycophantic, how to read the mood of a room the moment he entered it. From Turin, he moved to the court of the Duke of Savoy in Nice. This was a step up. The House of Savoy was ancient and powerful, a gateway between the Italian states and the great powers of Europe. Rizzio was polishing his resume, refining his manners. He was becoming a man of the Renaissance, educated, artistic, and ambitious. But Italy was crowded. Every court was teeming with second sons and talented artists vying for patronage. If Rizzio stayed, he would likely remain a minor functionary, a footnote in a duke's ledger. Then, in 1561, fate offered him a ticket to the edge of the known world. The Count of Moretta, the ambassador of Savoy, was preparing a diplomatic mission to the misty, turbulent kingdom of Scotland. He needed a retinue. He needed bright young men to handle correspondence, translation, and presentation. Rizzio secured a spot. One can only imagine what his friends in Nice thought. Scotland? To the sophisticated Italians, Scotland was arguably the end of the earth. It was viewed as a semi-barbaric land of ice and granite, torn apart by religious civil war, populated by warlords who spoke a guttural tongue. It was a place where the sun rarely shone and the wine was expensive and sour. But for David Rizzio, it was an open door. Where there is chaos, there is opportunity. He packed his trunks, bringing his lutes, his velvets, and his ambition, and boarded the ship that would carry him into the North Sea. The Scotland that greeted David Rizzio in 1561 was a kingdom in the throes of an identity crisis. The Protestant Reformation, led by the thunderous fire and brimstone preacher John Knox, was sweeping through the lowlands. Catholic shrines were being smashed, Latin Mass was outlawed, the old order was crumbling. Into this grim, gray Calvinist atmosphere sailed Mary Stuart. She was 19 years old, the widow of the King of France, returning to claim her Scottish throne after 13 years abroad. Mary was a creature of the French court, the most glittering, sophisticated court in Europe. She loved dancing, masks, poetry, and hunting. She was a devout Catholic in a country that had just declared Catholicism illegal. When the ambassador of Savoy arrived at Holyrood, Rizzio was merely a face in the crowd of the delegation, but he had eyes, and he saw the dynamic immediately. He saw a young queen who was profoundly lonely. Mary was surrounded by her half-brother, Lord James Stuart, later the Earl of Moray, and the fierce Scottish lords, men like Maitland of Leithington and the Earl of Morton. These men were dour, politically ruthless, and constantly trying to undermine her authority. They lectured her on her religion. They scolded her for her frivolous French habits. Mary was starving for civilization. She was desperate for music, for art, for laughter, for anything that reminded her of the warmth of France. The Queen maintained a quartet of valets de chambre, singers to entertain her during Mass in private and during supper. But they had a problem. They were missing a bass. They needed a deep, resonant voice to anchor the harmonies. Word reached the Queen that the ambassador of Savoy had a man in his retinue with a remarkable voice. Rizzio was invited to perform. This was the moment. Rizzio stood before the young, beautiful Queen. He did not look like a hero. Historical accounts are universally cruel about his appearance. He was described as short, swarthy, and ill-favored, a polite term for ugly. Sir James Melville, a diplomat of the time, dismissed him as a merry fellow and a good musician, but noted his strange appearance. Some later sources, perhaps exaggerating to make him seem more monstrous, claimed he had a hunchback or a twisted spine. In a court dominated by tall, athletic men, warriors who spent their days in the saddle and their nights drinking ale, Rizzio was an oddity, a little twisted Italian peacock. But when he sang, the physical deformities faded. He offered Mary a connection to the world she missed. He spoke flawless French and Italian. He understood the references to Ronsard's poetry. He knew the latest gossip from Turin and Paris. When the Count of Moretta's diplomatic business was concluded and the delegation packed to return to the sunny comforts of Savoy, Rizzio made a bold move. He asked to stay. Mary, delighted to have found a bass for her quartet, agreed immediately. He was hired as a valet de chambre for a salary of roughly 80 Scots pounds a year. It was a respectable wage for a servant, but hardly a fortune. The Scottish lords barely glanced at him. Why would they? He was a servant. He was a singer. He was there to provide background noise while the great men discussed the fate of nations. He was a merry fellow to amuse the girl queen. They dismissed him as a non-entity. That was their first and most fatal mistake. They saw a jester. They didn't see the Machiavelli hiding beneath the motley. They didn't realize that in the vacuum of loyalty that surrounded Mary, this little Italian was about to fill the void. Rizzio settled into his small quarters. He began to learn the landscape of the court. He watched the Earl of Moray bully the Queen. He watched John Knox reduce her to tears with his misogynistic tirades. And he realized that Mary needed more than a bass singer. She needed a shield. She needed a weapon. And David Rizzio decided he would be both. While the lords dismissed him as a mere entertainer, Rizzio was quietly observing the fractures in the court. He saw that music could only take him so far, but secrets could take him anywhere. The leap from the choir stall to the council chamber might have seemed impossible to the Scottish nobility, but for a man who had already crossed a continent to reinvent himself, it was simply the next logical step. As fate would have it, a vacancy was about to open that would allow the merry fellow to show his true, steely colors. The background singer was about to step to the front of the stage. The transformation of David Rizzio from a background musician to the most powerful man in Scotland did not happen overnight, but when it did happen, it struck with the force of an avalanche. For the first few years of his service, Rizzio was careful. He played his part, the humble servant, always ready with a witty remark or a soothing melody when the Queen was stressed. But he was also watching. He noticed that Mary's administration was porous. Her French secretary, Augustin Rollet, was a competent man, but possessed a fatal flaw. He was loose-lipped. In the viper's nest of Holyrood, information was the only commodity that mattered, and Rollet was spending it freely. In December 1564, the axe fell. Rollet fell out of favor, likely for leaking the Queen's private correspondence to her enemies. Mary, feeling betrayed and isolated, looked around for someone she could trust implicitly. She didn't want a Scottish lord who would only report back to his clan chief. She didn't want an Englishman. She needed a creature of her own making. She turned to the bass singer. At first, Rizzio was merely asked to handle the Queen's French correspondence. Then, he began drafting letters to the Pope and the Catholic powers of Europe. Before long, he was installed as the Queen's French secretary. The shift in power was seismic. Rizzio moved from the servants' quarters to a suite of rooms directly adjacent to the Queen's private apartments. In fact, his room was strategically located. To get to the Queen, one often had to go through him. The musician became the gatekeeper. The Scottish nobility, proud and ancient, were suddenly forced to endure a humiliation they could scarcely comprehend. If a powerful earl wanted an audience with his sovereign, he had to apply to Signor Davy. If a baron wanted a land grant signed, he had to ensure Davy put it at the top of the pile. And Davy, the poor boy from Piedmont, discovered he had a taste for the high life. He began to exact a toll. Bribery was commonplace in the 16th century. It was the grease of the political machine. But Rizzio practiced it with an ostentatious flair that enraged the Scots. He took bribes for access. He took bribes for influence. The money poured in. The shamefaced poor Italian began to dress better than the dukes. He cast aside his servant's livery and draped his small, twisted frame in the finest velvets imported from Genoa, satins from France, and furs from the Baltic. He wore heavy gold chains that clanked against his chest. When he died, the inventory of his personal treasury revealed over 2,000 pounds in gold coin, a staggering fortune that rivaled the wealth of the oldest families in the realm. Success made him arrogant. Rizzio knew he was smarter than the rough-hewn men around him, and he stopped bothering to hide it. He spoke to lords with a familiarity that bordered on insolence. There is a famous anecdote that encapsulates the hatred brewing against him. One day, a high-ranking Scottish nobleman arrived at the palace, demanding to see the Queen on urgent business. He was told to wait. The Queen was occupied. After fuming in the antechamber for an hour, the door finally opened. The lord stormed in, expecting to find Mary with a council of state. Instead, he found David Rizzio. The Italian was sitting, an act of incredible presumption in itself, and worse, he was sitting with his hat on in the presence of the Queen. He was chatting with Mary as an equal, while she laughed at his jokes. To the Scottish lord, this was not just rude, it was an inversion of the natural order. A base-born foreigner was sitting covered, while the nobility stood bareheaded. It was a sign that the world had gone mad. If Rizzio had remained merely a greedy secretary, he might have survived. He might have eventually been dismissed or exiled. But Rizzio made a play for the crown itself, not for him to wear, but for him to control. Enter Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. In 1565, the tall, striking Lord Darnley arrived in Scotland. He was Mary's cousin, and like her, he had a claim to the English throne. He was by all accounts physically magnificent. He was described as the lustiest and best proportioned long man of his age. He was a golden boy, athletic, charming, and with a pedigree that was impeccably royal. He was also, as history would soon prove, a vacuous, drunken, vicious narcissist. But Mary, blinded by infatuation and the political necessity of securing her dynasty, fell wildly in love, or at least she fell in lust. The Scottish Protestant lords, led by Mary's half-brother Moray, were terrified of this match. A marriage to Darnley would strengthen Mary's claim to the English throne and potentially re-establish a Catholic power bloc in Britain. They needed to stop it. But they found themselves outmaneuvered by an unlikely alliance. David Rizzio threw his full weight behind Darnley. It was a strange pairing. The towering, empty-headed Anglo-Scottish aristocrat and the small Machiavellian Italian secretary. Yet for a time, they were inseparable. Rizzio saw Darnley as the perfect puppet. If Mary married Darnley, the Protestant lords would be sidelined and Rizzio's influence would be secure. Darnley, in turn, saw Rizzio as the key to the Queen's heart. They became bedfellows. This term has sparked centuries of debate. Contemporary accounts confirm that Rizzio and Darnley sometimes shared a bed. In the 16th century, bed sharing among men was a common practice for warmth, security, or simply lack of space, and did not automatically imply homosexuality. However, the intensity of their bond, the way they huddled together, plotting, playing cards late into the night, fueled dark rumors. Darnley's enemies whispered that he was too intimate with the Italian. Later, these rumors would twist into a weapon against Mary, suggesting a depraved court where sexual boundaries were fluid and immoral. Whatever the nature of their relationship, the strategy worked. Rizzio smoothed the path. He carried love letters. He advised Mary to ignore the warnings of her brother and Queen Elizabeth I of England. He championed the long lad. On July 29, 1565, Mary, Queen of Scots, married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It was the zenith of Rizzio's career. He had made a king. The Protestant lords rebelled in fury, the chase about raid, but they were crushed and forced into exile in England. Rizzio was now the undisputed master of Holyrood. He had defeated the great earls. He had the Queen's ear and the king's friendship. He was untouchable, or so he thought. The honeymoon lasted barely a few weeks. Mary was intelligent, capable, and politically astute. Darnley was none of these things. Once the wedding festivities faded, the Queen realized she had married a liability. Darnley was constantly drunk, scouring the taverns of Edinburgh for trouble. He was abusive to her staff and dismissive of her duties. Worse, he was power-hungry. He demanded the crown matrimonial. This was a specific legal grant that would make Darnley equal to Mary in every way. It would mean he wasn't just a king consort, like Prince Philip to Queen Elizabeth II. He would be king in his own right. If Mary died, perhaps in childbirth, he would retain the throne for his lifetime, bypassing the rightful heirs. Mary, realizing her mistake, refused. She kept the Great Seal, the stamp of royal authority, firmly in her own possession. Or rather, she entrusted it to her secretary. David Rizzio, who had been Darnley's greatest champion, now became his greatest obstacle. Rizzio saw that Darnley was a disaster. He began to advise the Queen to restrict her husband's power. He told her to keep the purse strings tight. When Darnley demanded money, he was told to speak to Rizzio. When Darnley wanted a signature, he was told to wait for Rizzio. The friendship between the king and the secretary curdled into a toxic hatred. Darnley, in his drunken paranoia, felt humiliated. He was the king. Why did he have to beg a base-born fiddler for his allowance? And then the whispers started. Darnley didn't come up with the idea on his own. He wasn't smart enough. The exiled Protestant lords and their allies still in Scotland, men like Maitland and Morton, saw an opportunity. They approached the sulking, furious king. They dripped poison into his ear. "Why does the queen refuse you the crown matrimonial?" they whispered. "It is not her doing. It is the Italian." They went further. "Why is the Italian always in her chamber? Why does he stay late into the night? Why does she smile at him and not you?" They planted the most dangerous seed a man can plant in the mind of a king: cuckoldry. Mary was pregnant. The child was the future of the dynasty. But the lords whispered to Darnley that the child might not be his. The gossips in the filthy closes of Edinburgh began to joke about the son of Senior Davy. For Darnley, a man whose entire identity was built on his vanity, this was the ultimate insult. The man he had once shared a bed with was now stealing his wife, his crown, and his legacy. The trap was set. The Protestant lords offered Darnley a deal, written in blood. They would grant him the crown matrimonial. They would return him to his rightful place as master of the kingdom. In exchange, Darnley had to do two things: bring the exiled lords back to Scotland and help them cut off the enemy of the state. Darnley signed the bond. It was a death warrant. By March 1566, the atmosphere in Holyrood was suffocating. Rizzio received warnings. A French astrologer reportedly told him to beware the bastard, referring to the Earl of Moray. Rizzio laughed it off. "The Scots are more talk than action," he boasted. "They are barking dogs." He believed his proximity to the Queen was a magic circle that no one dared cross. He believed that holding the Queen's favor made him immortal. He did not know that the dogs had stopped barking and were preparing to bite. The ink on the death warrant was dry, and the conspirators had hardened their hearts against treason. Rizzio, blinded by the glitter of his own success, failed to see the shadows lengthening in the corners of Holyrood. He believed the Queen's favor was an impenetrable shield, but he was about to learn that in Scotland, steel cuts through favor. The time for whispering in dark corridors was over. The time for action had arrived. The storm that had been brewing for months was about to break on a quiet Saturday evening, a night that began with a song and ended in a scream. Saturday, March 9th, 1566. The winter in Edinburgh hangs heavy and wet. Outside the walls of Holyrood House, the city is dark, the narrow closes and winds choked with smoke and fog. Inside the palace, the Queen's apartments are an island of warmth and light. It is 8 p.m. The palace is quiet, or at least it seems so. But beneath the floorboards, in the king's apartments, men are arming themselves. They are strapping on breastplates, checking the priming on their pistols, and loosening their daggers in their sheaths. Mary, Queen of Scots, is in her private supper closet. To understand the terror of what is about to happen, one must understand the geography of this room. It is not a banquet hall. It is a cabinet, a tiny, intimate space, barely 12 feet by 10 feet, built into the thickness of the northwest tower wall. It is a place of retreat, a sanctuary where the Queen can escape the prying eyes of the court. The room is furnished with the heavy, opulent taste of the Valois court. A small table is set for supper. A daybed sits against the wall. A fireplace crackles, fighting off the chill of the stone walls. The gathering is small and domestic. Mary sits at the table. She is 6 months pregnant, her body swollen and uncomfortable. Beside her sits her half-sister, the Countess of Argyll. At the head of the table, or perhaps on a chest nearby, sits Arthur Erskine, the captain of her guard, and Lord Robert Stuart. And there, sitting with his hat on, dressed in a gown of furred damask, a satin doublet, and hose of russet velvet, is David Rizzio. He is relaxed. He is eating the Queen's meat, drinking her wine. He is likely joking, his sharp wit cutting through the dullness of the Scottish winter. He feels safe. After all, he is in the Queen's own closet, the heart of the royal stronghold. He does not hear the creak of the door behind him. There was a secret in the architecture of Holyrood. A narrow spiral staircase, a privy turnpike, led directly from the king's apartments below up to the Queen's bedroom, bypassing the public guards in the presence chamber. It was a staircase designed for lovers. Tonight it is being used by assassins. The door to the private staircase opens. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, steps into the room. He is tall, flushed, and his eyes are glassy. He has been drinking, fortifying his weak nerves with wine. He walks to the table. The conversation stops. Rizzio likely stands to bow, but Darnley waves him down. The king walks to the back of the Queen's chair. He leans over her, his breath smelling of alcohol, and kisses her on the neck. He puts his arm around her waist, an embrace that feels possessive and cold. "How are you, my love?" he might have mumbled. Mary is confused. Their relationship has been icy for weeks. This sudden affection is jarring. "My lord?" she asks, turning to look at him. It is the signal. The curtain covering the door is swept aside violently. Standing in the threshold is a figure from a nightmare. It is Patrick Ruthven, Lord Ruthven. He is supposedly on his deathbed, suffering from an incurable inflammation of the liver and kidneys. He is gaunt, skeletal, his face the color of parchment, but he has strapped a steel breastplate over his sick gown. He leans heavily on a cane, his breath rattling in his chest. He looks like a revenant, a corpse that has walked out of its grave to claim a soul. The room freezes. The Countess of Argyle drops her fork. Mary's heart begins to hammer against her ribs. She knows Ruthven is an enemy. She knows he should be in bed, dying. His presence here, armed and armored, is an act of treason. Mary rises, her voice trembling but regal. "My Lord Ruthven, what brings you here in this fashion? Are you mad?" Ruthven's voice is a dry rasp. He ignores the Queen. His eyes are fixed on the Italian in the corner. "Let it please your Majesty," Ruthven croaks, "to let yonder man David come forth of your privy chamber, where he has been too long. The pretense is over. He is here by my will." Mary flashes back, moving to stand between Ruthven and her secretary. She turns to her husband, the tall coward standing behind her. "My Lord King, what is the meaning of this? Do you know of this?" Darnley steps back, mumbling, looking at the floor. "I know nothing of it." He lies. Rizzio realizes the truth. The color drains from his swarthy face. He looks from the sickly Ruthven to the silent king. He sees the trap snapping shut. Ruthven steps forward. "Madame, he has offended your honor," he growls. "He has offended your husband. He has caused the banishment of the nobility." He lunges for Rizzio. Mary tries to block him, but the tiny room suddenly explodes with noise. From the secret staircase more men pour in. The Earl of Morton's men, Kerr of Faldonside, George Douglas. They crowd into the small space, jostling, shouting. The room is too small for violence. It is a crush of bodies. "Justice!" someone screams. "A Douglas! A Douglas!" The table is struck. It tips over. The heavy silver candelabra crashes to the floor. The plates, the meat, the wine spill across the floorboards. The room plunges into semi-darkness, lit only by the single candle that the Countess of Argyle manages to snatch from the falling table and hold high above the fray. In the flickering, grotesque shadows, David Rizzio panics. He does not draw a weapon. He is not a soldier. He is a musician. He scrambles backward, retreating into the window bay. But there is nowhere to go. He runs to the Queen. He falls to his knees. He grabs the folds of her dress. He wraps his arms around her waist, pressing his face against her pregnant belly. He clings to her as a drowning man clings to a raft. Justitia, he screams, his voice high and shrill with terror. Justitia, sauve ma vie, save my life, madame. The code of chivalry, the ancient laws of Scotland, and the laws of God all dictate that the person of the monarch is inviolable. To touch the queen is treason. To draw a weapon in her presence is death. But the men in this room have abandoned all laws. Andrew Kerr of Faldonside steps forward. He pulls a pistol, a crude wheel-lock firearm, from his belt. He cocks it. He presses the cold steel barrel against the queen's stomach. "Let him go," Kerr hisses, "or I shall shoot." Mary stares down the barrel of the gun. She does not flinch. "If you kill me," she says, "the child will be avenged." It is a stalemate for a fraction of a second. Then George Douglas, Darnley's illegitimate uncle or cousin, accounts vary, but he is of the Douglas blood, breaks the deadlock. He reaches across the queen's shoulder. He is so close that his arm brushes her neck. He snatches the king's own dagger from Darnley's belt. "This is the king's blow," he might have shouted. He plunges the dagger downward, over the queen's shoulder, and drives it into Rizzio's side. Rizzio shrieks. The first blood spatters onto the queen's dress. The spell is broken. The scent of blood drives the men into a frenzy. They grab Rizzio. They wrench his fingers from the queen's skirts. His grip is so tight, born of mortal terror, that they have to bend his fingers back until they snap to break his hold. Mary is shoved back into the arms of Darnley, who holds her fast, forcing her to watch. "Save me, madame. Save me." Rizzio's cries are fading as they drag him toward the door. They haul him out of the supper closet through the queen's bedchamber. He is kicking, screaming, grasping at the bedposts, grasping at the furniture, but there is nowhere to go. They drag him into the outer audience chamber. This is a larger room near the fireplace. Here, the discipline collapses. It becomes a slaughter. Every man wants to land a blow. Every man wants to prove he is part of the bond. They fall upon the small velvet-clad figure like wolves. They stab him in the chest. They stab him in the throat. They stab him in the groin. The daggers rise and fall in a blur of motion. The expensive Genoese velvet is shredded. The gold chains are broken, scattering links across the floor. The music of the bass singer is silenced, replaced by the wet thud of steel into flesh, 56 times. The coroner's report, or the historical equivalent, would later count 56 distinct wounds. It was overkill. It was hatred made manifest. Finally, the movement stops. David Rizzio lies in a pool of blood that spreads rapidly across the floorboards, the blood that will create the indelible stain. He is dead. But there is one final act of cruelty, one final message to send. Someone, tradition says it was George Douglas, but acting on the collective will, takes the dagger that belongs to King Henry Darnley. They leave it sticking out of Rizzio's chest. It is a signature. It tells the world, the king did this. The king sanctioned this. Silence falls over the audience chamber. The men stand panting, their hands slick with red. The only sound is the crackle of the fire and the distant weeping of the queen in the next room. Back in the closet, Mary stands amidst the wreckage of her supper. She is trembling, but she is alive. She turns to Darnley, who has released her now that the deed is done. She looks at him with a coldness that is more terrifying than rage. She realizes now exactly what he is. He's not just a fool. He's a traitor who brought death into her sanctuary and threatened the life of their unborn child. When a servant finally comes to the door and confirms that Signor Davy is dead, Mary dries her eyes. The weeping stops. The steel enters her spine. "No more tears now," she says, her voice low and hard. "I will think upon revenge." Rizzio's body is unceremoniously dragged by the heels down the winding main stairs. His head bumps against the stone steps. They strip him of his fine clothes, tearing the jewels from his cold fingers. They leave him in the porter's lodge, a bloody heap of rags on a wooden bench. A porter, looking down at the mangled corpse of the man who had ruled Scotland only hours before, delivers the epitaph, "This was his destiny." For on this chest was his ambition. The singer is dead, but the song of vengeance is just beginning. The deed was done, and the conspirators wiped their blades, believing they had crushed the queen's spirit along with her secretary's body. They expected a grieving, broken woman who would submit to their rule. But as the blood congealed on the floorboards, a transformation was taking place in the room next door. The shock of the brutality did not break Mary Stuart. It forged her. The men who thought they were the hunters had just locked themselves in a cage with a lioness who was already plotting her escape and her revenge. The silence that settled over Holyrood House in the hours following the murder was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a held breath. David Rizzio was dead, his body cooling on a bench in the porter's lodge. But the coup was far from over. The palace was now a prison. 80 armed men, loyal to the Earl of Morton and Lord Ruthven, patrolled the corridors. The gates were locked. Mary, Queen of Scots, was no longer a sovereign. She was a hostage in her own home. Confined to her chambers, separated from her ladies, and fearing for her life, Mary faced a terrifying reality. The lords debated her fate openly. Some argued that she should be imprisoned in Stirling Castle for the rest of her life. Others, darker in their ambition, suggested that accidents happen to pregnant women in times of stress. If she died in childbirth, or if she miscarried and faded away, the problem of Mary Stuart would be solved. But the conspirators had made a critical error. They had underestimated the woman they were dealing with. They saw a 23-year-old girl who loved music and dancing. They forgot she was the granddaughter of Henry VII of England and the daughter of James V of Scotland. She had iron in her blood. While the lords celebrated their victory, drinking the palace wine and drafting proclamations, Mary went to work. She knew she could not fight 80 men with swords. She had only one weapon left, her voice, and she knew exactly where to aim it. Henry Darnley was wandering the halls, flush with the adrenaline of the murder, but the high was wearing off. The reality was setting in. He had betrayed his wife, the Queen, in the most violent way possible. Mary requested to see him. When Darnley entered her chamber, he likely expected screaming, tears, or hysteria. Instead, he found a woman who was calm, logical, and terrifyingly persuasive. Mary played the performance of her life. She didn't scream at him for the murder of Rizzio. That bridge was burned. Instead, she whispered to his fears. She pointed out the obvious. The lords Ruthven, Morton, and Moray did not love Darnley. They despised him. They had used him as a battering ram to break down the Queen's authority. "Think, Henry," she might have murmured, her hand perhaps resting on her swollen stomach. "Once they have destroyed me, who stands in their way? You? Do you think they will let you rule? They will kill you next." It is a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. And it was entirely true. Darnley, whose vanity was only matched by his cowardice, felt the ice water of realization drench his spine. He looked at the hard faces of the lords outside the door, the men who had just butchered a man 56 times, and he realized he was alone. He broke. He fell to his knees, weeping, confessing everything. He gave Mary the names of every conspirator. He told her of the bond. He defected back to her side. Mary did not forgive him. She would never forgive him, but she needed him. Monday, March 11th, 1566, 2 days after the murder. The plan was desperate. At midnight, the palace was asleep. The guards, perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by the king's assurances that the Queen was subdued, were lax. Mary and Darnley, accompanied by a single servant and the captain of her guard, Arthur Erskine, slipped out of the royal apartments. They did not go through the front gates. They descended into the bowels of the palace. They made their way through the servants' tunnels and, in a stroke of grim irony, through the very crypts of the abbey, where Rizzio's body had just been dumped into a shallow, fresh grave. They emerged into the freezing night air near the stables. Horses were waiting. Mary was 6 months pregnant. Riding at a gallop was dangerous. It risked a miscarriage that could kill both her and the heir, but staying meant death. She mounted behind Erskine on a pillion. "Ride," she commanded. They rode hard for Dunbar Castle, 25 miles away on the coast. It was a brutal journey through the pitch-black Scottish countryside. At one point, Darnley, terrified of pursuit, urged them to go faster, whipping the horses in a panic. "Come on," he shouted. "They will catch us and cut us to pieces." Mary, clutching her stomach, enduring the agony of the bouncing saddle, reportedly told him to be silent. She was riding to save her crown. He was riding to save his skin. They reached Dunbar as the sun rose. The gates opened. They were safe. Once safe, Mary unleashed the full power of the monarchy. She sent out the call to the loyal lords, Bothwell and Huntley, who had escaped Holyrood during the confusion of the murder. They came with thousands of spears. Within a week, Mary marched back to Edinburgh at the head of an army of 8,000 men. The conspirators, Ruthven, Morton, Lindsay, did not wait to see the whites of her eyes. They fled south, galloping across the border into England. The coup had collapsed. The Queen had won. When Mary re-entered Holyrood House on March 18th, the blood was still staining the floor of her supper closet. The trauma of that night still hung in the air, but her first act was one of defiance. She ordered the body of David Rizzio to be exhumed. The lords had buried him like a dog in a common grave outside the abbey doors, a final insult to his base origins. Mary would not allow it. She had his body lifted from the earth. She had it washed and prepared. And then, in a move that scandalized the Scottish nobility more than the murder itself, she ordered him to be reburied in the royal vault of the Abbey of Holyrood. David Rizzio, the musician from Piedmont, the varlet, the imp, was laid to rest alongside the bones of the kings of Scotland. He lay beside James V, Mary's father. To the Protestant lords, this was blasphemy. It was the ultimate confirmation of their darkest rumors. Why else would a servant lie among kings unless he was the king's lover? But to Mary, it was not about sex. It was about loyalty. Rizzio had died for her. He had died because he served her. In a world of shifting allegiances and treacherous kin, he had been the only one who stayed true. Raising him to the level of kings was her way of saying that loyalty was the only nobility that mattered. Rizzio was at peace, but the violence he unleashed was like a contagion. It could not be contained. Henry Darnley was a dead man walking. He had betrayed the Queen to the lords, and then betrayed the lords to the Queen. He had no friends left on earth. Mary grew to loathe him. She could not look at him without seeing Rizzio's blood on his hands. She could not feel the child kick in her womb without remembering the pistol pressed against her belly. Less than a year later, in February 1567, the bill came due. Darnley was staying at a house called Kirk-a-Field, just outside the city walls, recovering from an illness, likely syphilis. In the middle of the night, a massive explosion tore the house apart. Gunpowder had been stacked in the cellar. Darnley's body was found in the garden, untouched by the fire, but strangled. Who killed him? Was it the Earl of Bothwell? Was it the returning lord seeking revenge for his betrayal? Was Mary herself complicit? Historians still argue, but one thing is certain. Darnley's death was the second act of the tragedy that began in the supper closet. The violence that started with the stabbing of the Italian secretary spiraled into a civil war that would eventually cost Mary her throne, her freedom, and finally, her head. The indelible stain on the floorboards of Holyrood is not just a mark of Rizzio's death. It is the mark of the death of the Stuart dynasty's hope. The child who survived the womb, James VI, would grow up to be a man terrified of drawn swords. He wore padded doublets to protect against assassins. He was a creature of anxiety and paranoia. The shadow of Rizzio's murder fell long over his reign. David Rizzio came to Scotland to sing. He ended up changing the course of British history, not with his voice, but with his blood. And if you stand in that quiet room in the Northwest Tower today, when the tourists have gone and the winter wind howls against the stone, you can almost hear the echo of the chaos, the crash of the table, the scream of Justitia, and you can look at the stain and remember, in the game of power, the most dangerous thing you can do is rise above your station. The players in this tragedy eventually left the stage, Mary to the executioner's axe, Darnley to the strangler, and the lords to their own violent ends. Yet, the story of David Rizzio did not end with his reburial in the royal vault. Death only fueled the legend. As the years passed, the facts of his life were swallowed by the myths of his influence, giving rise to scandals that would haunt the Stuart dynasty for generations. To fully understand this bloody legacy, we must look beyond the politics of the murder and examine the dark whispers that lingered long after the screams had faded. The body of David Rizzio may have been buried, but the rumors surrounding his life refused to die. In fact, they grew more monstrous with time, eventually threatening the legitimacy of the British crown itself. The most explosive question whispered in taverns in the 16th century and debated by historians ever since is one of paternity. Was David Rizzio the biological father of King James VI of Scotland and James I of England? On the surface, the timeline allows it. Rizzio and Mary were incredibly close during the period of conception, summer 1565. Mary's relationship with Darnley was volatile. While they were undeniably sleeping together in the early weeks of their marriage, their alienation happened quickly. The enemies of the Stuart dynasty seized upon this. Henri IV of France, upon seeing James VI for the first time, famously remarked with a sneer that James could truly be called the modern Solomon, not because of his wisdom, but because he was the son of David. The slur was devastating. It implied that the entire Stuart line, and by extension the Windsors who sit on the throne today, descended not from royal blood, but from a base-born Italian servant. But does the history hold up? Physically, James VI bore no resemblance to the swarthy, small Rizzio. James had the sandy hair and the long, somewhat awkward limbs of the Stuarts. However, James did suffer from physical difficulties. A tongue that was too large for his mouth, a shambling gait that gossips attributed to the bad blood of the Italian or the trauma of the murder itself. Modern historians largely dismiss the paternity theory. Mary was a woman of intense royal pride. She viewed her lineage as sacred. The idea that she would risk her throne and her soul to sleep with a servant runs contrary to everything we know about her character. She was flirtatious, yes, and she lacked political judgment, but she was not sexually reckless in the way her enemies claimed. The son of David rumor was likely just that, a weapon of war forged by the Protestant lords to delegitimize Mary and control her son. If the relationship between Mary and Rizzio was almost certainly platonic, the relationship between Rizzio and Darnley remains a much murkier subject. We know for a fact that they were bedfellows. In the diplomatic reports of the time, specifically those of Thomas Randolph, the English ambassador, it is recorded that Rizzio and Darnley lay in the same bed. As previously noted, in the overcrowded palaces of the 1500s, sharing a bed was common. Soldiers did it, brothers did it, servants did it. It was often a practical measure against the freezing Scottish cold. However, the context here is different. Darnley was a king, or at least a king consort. Rizzio was a servant. For a king to share his bed with a servant was a breach of protocol that suggests an intense emotional or physical intimacy. Some queer historians argue that Rizzio may have been Darnley's lover before he became his enemy. Darnley was known for his debauchery and his fluid morals. Rizzio was an outsider, unmoored from traditional Scottish masculinity. If there was a sexual dimension to their relationship, it adds a layer of tragic jealousy to the murder. It reframes the assassination not just as a political coup, but as a lover's quarrel gone nuclear. Did Darnley kill Rizzio because he felt politically sidelined, or because he felt personally rejected when Rizzio shifted his loyalty to Mary? The ferocity of Darnley's hatred, the way he insisted on being present for the kill, the way he wanted his dagger left in the body, suggests a passion that goes beyond mere politics. Beyond the sex scandals, there was the charge of espionage. The Scottish lords justified the murder by claiming Rizzio was a papal agent, a spy sent by the Vatican to overthrow the Protestant religion in Scotland. Was there any truth to this? Rizzio was certainly a devout Catholic, and, as Mary's French secretary, he was indeed the conduit for her correspondence with the Pope and the Catholic powers, Spain, France, Savoy. He was undoubtedly urging Mary to be tougher on the Protestant lords. He was an obstacle to the Reformation. However, there is no evidence that he was a spy in the modern sense. He wasn't a secret agent running a network. He was a bureaucrat who had risen too high. The irony is that Rizzio was likely less of a religious zealot than his enemies claimed. He was a pragmatist. He wanted money, status, and fine clothes. He pushed the Catholic cause because that was the source of his power, not necessarily because he was a fanatic. The popish plot was a convenient narrative. It allowed men like Ruthven and Morton, who were essentially gangsters fighting for their own land and power, to dress up their greed as religious crusading. They weren't murdering a man, they were saving the soul of the nation. Finally, we cannot ignore the supernatural element. In the 16th century, the line between science, music, and magic was thin. Rizzio was a foreigner. He was intelligent. He seemed to have a hypnotic control over the queen. To the superstitious Scottish mind, this could only mean one thing: witchcraft. Rumors swirled that Rizzio was a necromancer. People whispered that he possessed a spirit or a familiar that gave him knowledge of the future. They pointed to the fact that he had survived in the court so long against such odds as proof of dark arts. After his death, these stories multiplied. The inability to remove the bloodstain from the floor was seen as supernatural proof of his evil, or perhaps of his innocence crying out to God. There is a story that Rizzio was warned by a seer to beware of the bastard. Rizzio assumed this meant the Earl of Moray, Mary's illegitimate brother. He didn't realize that the bastard who would strike the first blow was actually George Douglas, the illegitimate son of the Earl of Angus. Whether Rizzio dabbled in the occult is doubtful, but the belief that he did made it easier for his killers to justify their actions. They weren't just killing a secretary. They were purging a warlock from the holy halls of the king. So who was David Rizzio, really? He was not a saint. He was greedy, arrogant, and blinded by his own ambition. He treated powerful men with contempt and flaunted his wealth in a poor country. In many ways, he dug his own grave with his tongue and his taste for gold. But he was also a victim of a brutal, xenophobic, and misogynistic culture. He was killed because he was foreign. He was killed because he was ugly and disabled. He was killed because he was a man who dared to be soft, a musician, a writer, a thinker, in a world of hard men. Most of all, he was killed because he was the proxy for Mary. The lords could not strike the queen directly yet, so they struck the thing she loved. They shattered her confidence by shattering her friend. David Rizzio's life was a comet, burning bright, rising fast, and ending in a crash that shook the earth. His legacy is not in the laws he wrote or the letters he drafted. It is in the tragedy of the Stuarts. It is in the indelible stain that tourists stare at today, shivering slightly in the cold air of the tower. It is a reminder that history is not just made on the battlefield. It is made in small rooms, with whispered secrets, jealous hearts, and the flash of a dagger in the candlelight.